Major breaking news. The future of the Federal Reserve System and whether or not it's constitutional may now be in litigation for real. This is a real alert, folks. This is not a game. This fight over Lisa Cook and whether or not President Trump has the authority as the President of the United States to remove Lisa Cook from her job as a governor of the Federal Reserve System may have just placed in the United States Supreme Court huge questions of whether or not the Federal Reserve can even exist. This is a big deal, folks, something that we've talked about before in American life for decades. And now the fight may be resolved. Let's break it down. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Box of Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, so as you know, in order to be the smartest person in the room when it comes to our right to keep and bear arms and Second Amendment, I need you to understand other aspects of constitutional law, because all aspects of constitutional law, how you interpret the structural Constitution, how you interpret the actual amendments to the Constitution, all of this plays a role because the methodologies and the processes and the precedents that are set by virtue of how the Supreme Court, for example, understands and interprets and applies the Constitution all touch fingers with each other. It's the metaphorical spiderweb I've explained to you of constitutional law, where if you pull one single strand of a spiderweb, you know what happens. The entire web moves, which means you need to understand all the different strands on a spider web of American constitutional law, because when you move one or change one, the entire web will move, including that part of the web that covers our right to keep and bear arms. Now, this has just occurred now. You maybe have seen this in the news, but a woman named Lisa Cook, who was nominated by Joe Biden and confirmed barely by the United States Senate with a tie-breaking vote originally by Kamala Harris, the vice president, and speaking in her role as the president of the Senate at the time. Lisa Cook has been a Federal Reserve governor in the Federal Reserve System. Now, just to step back, picture the Federal Reserve System is extremely important because it basically oversees all monetary policy of the United States, including the printing of money, inflation-related things, setting interest rates, all sorts of craziness that has huge impacts on our day-to-day life as to whether or not we pay more for fuel at the gas pumps, whether or not we may pay more for rent and for food, whether or not we can afford to buy stocks and invest in the stock market, whether or not the stock market crashes and goes down, causing all of our retirement funds to go down and our ability to save for retirement and pay for college education for our children and so on, all is impacted dramatically by the Federal Reserve System. Now, here is the thing. The Federal Reserve System has been around for many, 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 many decades. And there has always been, right from the start, huge questions about whether or not the Federal Reserve System is constitutional. Because as you know, the Founding Fathers set up the United States Constitution that created three branches of government. Article 1 of the Constitution creates the Congress, the legislative branch that passes the laws. Article 2 creates the presidency, the executive branch, which enforces the laws. That is, all of those powers in the executive branch are vested in a president, one president, that in this case today, that's President Donald J. Trump. And then Article 3 of the United States Constitution creates the Supreme Court and other inferior courts in the federal system that Congress creates. And those are the three branches of government. So the issue is with the Federal Reserve System, and this is a fight going all the way back to the Founding Fathers about the role of a federal bank, for example, a bank of the United States. The question is whether or not Congress has the authority to create an independent financial institution that is not subject to, for example, federal government oversight in the form of the President of the United States. This also speaks to some of the issues we've been seeing lately, which is Congress tries to create these independent agencies claiming that they're independent from influence by the President of the United States. But again, if you look at our U.S. Constitution, folks, there's only room for three branches of government: the Congress, the executive branch run by the President, and the judges under Article 3. So you have this thing called the Federal Reserve System overseen right now by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. And you probably have seen there's a big fight right now that Donald Trump wants Jerome Powell to reduce interest rates using the Federal Reserve policies, and Jerome Powell refuses to do so. And the reason why that's so significant is because the largest debtor in America, if not the world, is the United States government with all the money it's borrowed. every little basis point, every little click up or down on the interest rate scale has a dramatic impact on the amount of interest paid by the federal government on those treasury bills and treasury bonds. So Jerome Powell refusing to lower interest rates during the term of Donald Trump really makes the federal debt and the federal deficit go up, because it means the federal government has to pay more and more money for interest payments because the interest rates are being held high by the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, which is why the Federal Reserve is particularly political. And I should also mention, in contrast, and the reason why this is really, I think President Trump is so angry about this, if you go back to September, listen carefully, folks. If you go back to September 2024, on the eve of the 2024 presidential election, what was one of the big issues there? That was the economy. And did Joe Biden and Kamala Harris do a good job of the economy? So what did the same Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve System do on the eve of the 2024 November presidential election? Well, it turns out that in September 2024, Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve System lowered interest rates 50 basis points, which means 0.5%, a huge drop in interest rates in September 2024 to really gear up and gin up the stock market, and also to gin up the economy in those final months right before the 2024 election. So here you have Jerome Powell, the head of Federal Reserve, in September 2024, right before the election, dropping interest rates, making everything cheaper in the United States, so on. In contrast, right now, Donald Trump is the president, and guess what happens? They refuse to lower interest rates when Donald Trump is the president, but they lowered interest rates hugely in the era of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, especially before the 2024 election. So with all that said, the reason why you need to understand that political context is because it gives rise to what I'm about to discuss here, as to whether or not there's a constitutional argument that the Federal Reserve is illegal and needs to fall under the powers of the President of the United States, which give Donald Trump the power as the president to oversee the Federal Reserve and not have these independent bankers basically oversee it. And now this issue has always been very theoretical and abstract for the last many decades. Does the president have authority over the Federal Reserve, or is the Federal Reserve System some sort of hybrid fourth branch of government? And this has been a big debate. But now you have, and this is how it's come to a head, and that is that Lisa Cook, this woman, nominated to be on the Federal Reserve governor. She's a Federal Reserve governor. She's also, been confirmed by the Senate. It turns out, based on very strong documentary evidence, it hasn't been established in court yet, but there's strong evidence that she may very well have perjured herself and or otherwise lied on mortgage applications. At the same time today, while she's being investigated for alleged or potential crimes, felonies associated with lying on these mortgage applications, claiming things that were her primary residence to get lower rates and better deals when they weren't her primary residence, and things like this. Whether or not it's true, I don't know, but this is what the issue is swirling, because as part of the Federal Reserve System, guess what her job is? One of her big jobs, of course, is she helps set interest rates, which has the impact on mortgage rates. So here you have a woman allegedly engaging in mortgage-related fraud and perjury, allegedly. We don't know if it's true or not, but this is what's alleged. At the same time, today, she's in charge of mortgage rates for the United States of America. Seems to be a little bit of an issue. Now, the reason why this is a big deal, folks, is this gets into the relationship, the constitutional relationship, between the President of the United States under Article 2 of the Constitution, who's responsible for enforcing the law, and the Federal Reserve System, which is either some sort of private entity or it's like kind of a public entity that's a fourth branch of government, right? So Donald Trump has just announced, because of these allegations and evidence associated with potential mortgage fraud by Lisa Cook, he has announced that he is firing her. from the Federal Reserve System. He is firing her. And she has come back and said that she refuses to leave, that she has not been terminated, that Donald Trump, as the President of the United States, lacks the legal authority to fire her. So what does this give rise to? This is going to give rise to a big legal fight in court. Donald Trump is going to say, she's got to get out of the job. I fired her. I am the president in charge of Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. She works for essentially an administrative agency like the EPA, like the FDA. The Federal Reserve is just one of those things. I have the authority to fire her. She's going to come back with her lawyer and say, that's not true. I work for an independent agency for the Federal Reserve System. Donald Trump, as the President of the United States, does not have the legal authority to fire me. So what is going to happen? There's going to be a litigation here, and it's going to turn on two questions. The first question the narrow question is, Donald Trump, does he have the authority to fire a governor of the Federal Reserve System for cause if he believes that that governor, in this case Lisa Cook, has engaged in some sort of mortgage financial fraud or perjury? Does he have the authority to say, I find that she's engaged in fraud and perjury or whatever it is, and I think this is a good cause to fire her, and I'm firing her for a cause, which I'm allowed to do in all instances of everyone that works for the federal government? And Donald Trump will then argue in the alternative that anyway, the reality is the Federal Reserve System is not allowed constitutionally to be a fourth branch of government. And as a consequence, the Federal Reserve System is either totally unconstitutional and doesn't exist and we can ignore it from now on, or it falls under my authority under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution because as the President of the United States, I get to effectuate and enforce the laws of America. So Congress can create the Environmental Protection Agency, but I, as the executive, get to run the EPA. And Congress can create the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, but I, as Article 2 under the Constitution, I, as the president, get to run the FDA because I got to make sure these things run right. These are part of the executive branch. And that's going to give rise to a big question whether or not the Federal Reserve System falls under Article 2 powers of the executive branch or not. And if it doesn't fall into Article 2, then what exactly is this thing, the Federal Reserve System? It seems like it's a fourth branch of government. And I can tell you that Chief Justice John Roberts is very focused on the structural constitution and separation of powers issues. He's very focused on these issues. This is a big deal. Chief Justice John Roberts may not be the best and willing to push Second Amendment cases. I don't think he is, but he will push structural constitution arguments and separation of powers issues because it's something that's near and dear to his heart. That's just the reality is he's interested in that and thinks it's very important, and it is, and that's why you're seeing a lot of these issues. So this case, whether or not Donald Trump has the authority to fire Lisa Cook, is not just going to give rise to questions about whether or not he has the authority to fire her. It's also potentially going to give issues as to what the Federal Reserve System really is. Is it a fourth branch of government that doesn't exist outside of the Constitution? Because it can't be. There's no fourth branch of government in the Constitution, so that would be illegal. Or does the Federal Reserve System fall under Article 2? And if it does fall under Article 2 of the Constitution, that means it's run by a president. A president, that's in the text of the Article 2. And today, that a president today is Donald J. Trump, who gets to run the Federal Reserve System, which also will resolve this ongoing fight between Jerome Powell that wants to keep interest rates high to punish Donald Trump, as I see it, versus what Donald Trump wants, which is to lower interest rates so that we and Americans don't have to pay as much money on our federal debt because the federal government borrows lots and lots of money. So the higher the interest rates are, the more that we as the taxpayer have to pay in interest payments. The lower the interest rates are, the less we have to pay. And Jerome Powell, while helping out the Biden administration in 2024, refuses to help out the Donald Trump administration today. Of course, he's going to be leaving soon because his term is soon expiring, but you understand the legal issues right now. So the only other point I want to make about this Federal Reserve System, which, by the way, ready for this, folks? It has 23,000 employees. Did you hear what I just said? The Federal Reserve System has 23,000 employees. It's like every PhD in economics that doesn't go to Wall Street must go to work for the Federal Reserve System, it seems like. But anyway, I just want to give you the argument as to why there's an argument that the Federal Reserve System is constitutional. Now, there really is kind of three arguments here. The first argument is that under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the authority to oversee coinage and money. And the Federal Reserve System is involved with coinage and money, and therefore it has that authority to oversee it. So in addition to Article 1's power for Congress that says that they have the ability to deal with the money of the federal system, they also arguably have authority to deal with the public debt. They could say that the Federal Reserve System involves the public debt. And of course, they could say we view this as just another administrative agency that the president gets to oversee. But with all that said, all of this, of course, is arguments that Congress has the ability to create this bank. And kind of the final point is that if you look historically, there's been fights going all the way back to the founding father involving Alexander Hamilton, for example, whether or not the Congress has the ability to create the first bank of the United States, the second bank of the United States. These are ongoing battles about whether or not Congress has the authority to create a federal bank, because if you look at Article 1, again, it doesn't specifically say that Congress has the authority to create a bank. It does say it has the authority to borrow money on behalf of the United States. It does talk about it has authority to basically oversee the creation of money for the United States, but it doesn't specifically say that under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has the ability to create a central federal bank, which is something a guy like Alexander Hamilton from New York always wanted, but the farmers and the agrarians did not like that idea of giving this kind of power to the East Coast bankers that could mess with interest rates and do other terrible things to the people that borrowed the money, specifically the farmers. And there was this sort of tension between the Wall Street elite and, of course, the farmers and interest rates and things like this. And this is where this huge fight over the first and the second Bank of the United States arose kind of during our founding and early American history. With that said, in the 20th century, we have this Federal Reserve System. Whether or not it's constitutional has never been clearly decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. There are some passing references that by the Supreme Court indicating that this may be fine because it's some sort of private-public partnership. But with that said, it's never been fully resolved. And this battle over Lisa Cook may have the effect of putting the constitutionality of the entire Federal Reserve System at issue, because again, if Donald Trump has the authority to oversee the Federal Reserve System like every other administrative agency, he can hire and fire these people as a general matter because they work for him as the president. And if it's not under Article 2, then what exactly is the Federal Reserve System? Is it really a fourth branch of government? And if that is the argument, it's a fourth branch of government, it's going to be very difficult to square that with separation of powers and the fact that the Constitution only creates 3 branches of government. So again, watch very carefully. This is a big fight over the meaning of the Constitution. It may not specifically relate to the Second Amendment as you see it, but the reality is these fights over the scope of the Constitution, the powers of the federal government, have the impact in effect on things like the right to keep and bear arms, because the less authority Congress has, the better it is, because it means they lack the authority to reach out and touch other of our constitutional rights, because they simply don't have the authority to do so. So watch this case involving the Federal Reserve System very closely, and of course we'll see whether or not Lisa Cook ultimately gets indicted, because right now she's not been indicted for any crime, despite some of the allegations going on around some of the documents she signed associated supposedly with mortgages she was able to borrow from federally backed banks. There you have it, folks. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X at 4Boxes Diner. Don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble. I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the 4Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.